civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people.
We urgently need financial, political and social innovations that enable us to overcome this structural dependency on growth.
We need to change the system. This isn't cleaning up the beaches in the case of plastic a little bit faster. That's vital, that has to be done. But you need to stem the flow.
Go Simone explores sustainable change and the women inspiring it. Who are they? What made them who they are? How do they read the world they live in? Our guests share their story, roots, passions and hopes for the future. They tell us more about the alternatives and strategies they developed to tackle climate change. Our Simone today is Kylie Newberry. With Kylie, we talked about sustainable diet, building resilience within our cities, farmers markets certification, sharing the food production risk, and becoming food citizens. Kylie is a public health nutritionist by training. She has worked in Australia and abroad in the UK in particular. More recently, she completed a master in food policy in London. She created an organization called Our Food System, advocating for a healthy, sustainable and fair food system. Hi, Kylie.
Hi, Roxanne.
Thank you for joining us today this new episode of Go Simone.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kylie, you grew up in North Queensland and Brisbane later on. How was it to grow there and what kind of childhood did you have?
I think potentially many people would say this, but I feel I had a very normal childhood. In North Queensland, I feel very fortunate to have spent a lot of time in nature, in particular at within rainforests and at freshwater swimming holes. My parents grew up in Cairns, so, Dad was really a big part of sharing that with us. So whether I developed that connection with nature at an early age, but that certainly I have a very vivid memory of spending a lot of time in nature. Once we moved to Brisbane, then that's been my home since that period. And we grew up as a pretty active family. I have two younger sisters. We did swimming, we did netball, and we spent a lot of time just being active.
Then you chose to study public health and nutrition.
Yes.
Why did you choose this path and were your parents encouraging you?
I feel very fortunate that from a young age I knew what I wanted to do in a sense. So I remember at high school doing food and nutrition or home ec and then food and nutrition, and I just instantly connected with food. I was like, I find this really interesting. And so then when it came to choosing your senior subjects, you enter it in with guidance counsellor and it came out I liked food and I liked working with people, and so nutrition and dietetics spat out of the computer. And so I applied and I got in and I studied and I loved it, and I went on the pretty standard route of working in a hospital, and then I started to feel a bit disillusioned about this and recognising that it can be really hard for people to change their eating behaviours for whatever reason. I started to move more into the public health space, so focusing on prevention of ill health and promotion of good health rather than treating people through diet.
Going back to your childhood a little bit, what do you think attracted you in studying about food? Do you have food souvenirs? Was food important in your family?
We always sat down and ate a meal together. We still do. That's a big part of how we eat as a family. We ate, I think, pretty healthy food. And this is a number of years ago, but there wasn't that abundance of highly processed foods that we have now. So yes, they were available and we did eat those, but there was this focus on health, good food. One of my grandmas was really into cooking. Actually, both of them were, but I think potentially those seeds were planted at a young age.
How was your interest for the environment more broadly started?
I feel that it really came into focus when I attended Woodford in 2005. I'd finished uni, I'd travelled overseas and worked there for many years and travelled around, was very fortunate to see many countries around the world, and then went to Woodford. It was like my brain exploded and my heart, like I got introduced to many new ideas. Suddenly I started to go, okay, there's more to play here, and I guess I started with simple things like choosing green cleaning product, being conscious of my water use, or thinking about more active travel rather than using the car. But then, having an interest in food, I started to read more about food and the environment. And so I distinctly remember reading a few seminal books at the time. So I read Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, and I read The Ethics of What We Eat by Peter Singer. And this light bulb was going off in my head, like, wow, okay, there is a lot going on, and what can I do? Oh, and Food Inc., that movie probably was released around the same time. The things that I started to think about was around meat consumption and, okay, well, what can I do that can make a difference here? And meat seemed like a logical thing for me to remove from my diet. I wasn't a big meat eater, so it wasn't a huge shift for me. It still did take a while for me to become vegetarian, but I was like, this is something that I can do for the good of the planet.
You're describing yourself as a food advocate. Can you tell us more about what this role is?
I help facilitate change, I suppose. That's what I think about in terms of being a food advocate. So I do this at different levels. At the moment, I'm advocating with my local council about the need to grow more food in the city. I have spoken in council about things like having more rooftop gardens, having more urban agriculture in the city, and I am just starting to highlight ways in which we can change the food system for the better. But I also advocate for change with individuals, and I do that by encouraging people to think of themselves like food citizens and not just consumers who possibly just go to the shops, buy food without really taking note of where it might come from, how it's being produced, the impact that it has on the environment. And by shifting the way that we think of ourselves to more like a food citizen, we can really have a positive impact on creating a better food system.
You were mentioning that you were in contact with the city council. How do you find they receive your advocacy? Are they receptive?
They're open to hearing what I have to say. They're certainly doing some positive things around food. For me, I feel that there's so many more things that we could be doing, and I come at it from a perspective of the climate is changing. It's going to have an impact on our food system, whether that's through drought and how food is produced, or whether that affects our distribution systems. There are risks inherent within the way that currently food is grown and distributed around our country and around the world. Therefore, it's important that we start having to create resilience within our city, a food resilience. We need to have more food close to where people are, and the majority of people live in cities. That's why it's important to me to start the conversations and to start getting council on board. I do have something actually that I could share about councils. Recently here in Brisbane, the City Council announced that they're redeveloping Victoria Park, and it's 26 hectares of golf course and they're turning it into a parkland. And I see it as a perfect, myself and many others, space to have a small-scale farm, or a market garden is another term for it, a place where food is grown seasonally, free of chemicals, where people are walking through the park with their children, doing whatever they might be doing, and then they see food being grown and they begin to connect more with the food and taste it. You can buy it there at the farm gate, or you can buy it at a local farmers markets, but it's an opportunity for us here in Brisbane to say, hey, this is something that could be really positive for our city. We obviously provided this information through the community consultation process, and now we will wait to see what vision they release for the park in December.
The current food system poses serious problems of sustainability at different levels, environmental, but also social, cultural, and from a nutritional public health perspective. And you're particularly interested in food politics. In your views, what kind of policies or bills we should be advocating to ensure we collectively have access to food that is both nutritious and sustainably grown?
There's a lot that we could be doing from a health perspective. Some of the policies or regulations that have been flagged are around taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. Many people are doing a fabulous job of keeping this on the government's agenda. You know, they've clearly highlighted that that's not going to happen anytime soon here in Australia. But the George Institute in Sydney are really pushing, among many other people. So that is one way from a health perspective. Limiting the amount of food marketing that we're exposed to is another policy that we could definitely introduce. There's a really excellent campaign in the UK that's just started, and they highlight the impact that marketing has on people without them even knowing. And it's called Bite Back 2030. And I recommend jumping on YouTube and checking out the clip because it is eye-opening. From a sustainability perspective, I have a few ideas, but they're big things. So here's an example. In cities where the amount of prime farming agricultural land is diminishing because there have been a farm on there and farmers reach an age where they want to retire. And that's fair enough. And they want to sell their farm because they've worked extremely hard for all their lives and that is their retirement fund. But the challenge is, and developers are happy to buy that land and develop on it because we need more housing for people, but then we lose that. And so one thing that we could do is for governments to introduce the concept of farmland trusts where local government actually buy that land and they make it available to people who want to get into farming, like small young farmers. It's a way where we're still protecting land but also giving opportunities for people who want to start growing food because we need to start thinking about younger people growing more food because the average age of farmers in Australia is 60 plus. It's really concerning. Another thing that we could do is advocate for accrediting farmers markets. Many farmers markets are not just solely farmers. There's people there called resellers who go to the central markets to buy fruit and veg. And that can be really challenging, confusing
for the customers.
Confusing for the customers. In Victoria, they have the Victorian Farmers Markets Association, and they actually have a system of accreditation. And they say this farmers markets is solely farmers. And that's a really important thing for the consumer and for the farmer because it's really difficult when they're there trying to sell things and then there's people beside them. The other thing that I would say as a whole is in many areas or in a number of areas around Australia, they are developing their own food policy. So community food strategies or a community food policy or a food systems strategy that is at a community level or a town level, identifying key things that are needed to create a healthier, sustainable, fairer food system. So that would be amazing if we could have those across the board.
On health and sustainability, sometimes the advices contradict each other. For example, for a healthy diet, advocates will say you need to eat fish once a week, but we know now that overfishing is a problem. How do you reconcile both objectives? Is there ways to actually eat healthy food and be sustainable at the same time?
I have just an interesting story on that note. That particular example that you shared is what got me into this space. Esteemed lecturer called Tim Lang spoke at a conference, said that same thing. Nutritionists say eat 2 serves of fish for good health. Environmentalists say eat less fish because world stocks are depleting. And this alarm bell once again is going off like, okay, right. What do we need to do here? There's no fast rule. Look, the thing is that we can still eat sustainably and healthy. And actually, when you look at what is healthy core food, fruit and veggies, grains, sustainably produced meat, we can do it. There's a big shift that needs to occur. So it's definitely possible, but we need to be mindful of different areas where there's challenges such as fish.
Do you see regional patterns in the sustainable food movement? Do you observe at your level that it's a growing trend, or is it just an epiphenomenon?
I think deep down people want to do, like I'm talking about individuals here, so people want to do better things. You know, they want to support farmers or they want to make better choices for the environment. but it can be so complex that they're uncertain about where and how to start. Yes, there is becoming this global movement about, okay, what can I do? And not just my own personal food choices, but what else can I do to make a difference to creating a better food system?
Some food advocates see something missing in our new local farm-to-table food culture, that is people of color, and also people who don't have necessarily financial means. Natasha Bowens, who is a researcher in the field, writes, for example, rights to healthy food, rights to land, rights to a clean environment, and rights to an equal opportunity for success and livelihood for farmers are not fairly attainable. What do you think of this claim, and how do you think we can solve this problem?
When we look at the global food system, 70% of our food is actually coming from small-scale farmers. Majority of them are women. So particularly, I'm talking about mostly in developing countries here. Women begin working the land because the men are often have gone off to the cities to secure work. And women don't have the same rights as men in these situations. So they don't have equal access to land, the ability to often buy land. They often not as educated as men. And I think if we can actually treat women, in this instance in particular, the same as men, then we are going to have a much more inclusive and fairer food system. That is a very critical thing. Mm-hmm. It's not so much, I suppose, relatable to Australia, or maybe it is. I suppose what it is relatable to Australia is First Nations people. Mm-hmm. So their voice at the table when it comes to their own self-determination around food is lacking. So Indigenous food sovereignty is a really important and critical thing to take place here in Australia. Having them present at conversations and hearing and listening, and a really critical book, if anyone's interested in this area, is Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. It's a really fascinating and enjoyable book to read.
Do you see some initiatives, however, happening in Australia or here locally in Queensland that do try to be more inclusive with Indigenous people?
In Brisbane, Food Connect are doing a fabulous job of connecting with Indigenous people and really taking stock of their history and their past and what they need and how we can move forward together.
We'll move to diet again, because you've mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that you stopped eating meat at a point. And the debate over the merits of vegetarianism, not necessarily talking about veganism, but is often fierce. There's many eminent researchers in the field of food that have a wide range of opinions on this, and it's hard to find our way through it. For example, there's Mike Rayner, who is professor at the University of Oxford, who strongly argues the case that a meat tax is necessary, inevitable, if we want to cut the emissions on that side of the industry. Others, like Richard Young from the Sustainable Food Trust, challenges this idea, and he highlights the importance of grazing livestock that can bring to the environment as well. So do you have an opinion on this? Shall we transform our diets to be better to ourselves and to the planet?
This is an awesome question, because it's, meat is always such a contentious issue, and I'm really pleased that you've shared those two examples. I will put my thoughts on it. So the way that meat is currently produced on a global scale, it's highly intensive and it's a huge emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Most people might think that it's to do with the methane, but it's so much bigger than that. We have to grow grain to feed cows. And so there's the water use, there's the chemicals that go into growing the grain, there's the pollution runoff that comes from their waste and manure, particularly at the intensive feeding lots. So there's a lot that comes into the challenges with meat, in particular around land clearing. So the recent fires that took place in the Amazon were directly related to meat. And so land was being cleared in order for there to be grazing taking place. This current system of growing meat at this level is really bad for our environment. But there also is another way. And you know what? When I stopped eating meat, I was really black and white in my views around meat. I was like, it's terrible. Everyone has to eat less meat. And that was my perspective. And then I started to learn more about different farming methods, and in particular regenerative agriculture. And Charles Massey has written an incredible book on this called Call of the Reed Warbler. Grazing animals can play a really positive role in regenerating our soils, which help to then retain moisture and trap carbon. So within a holistic system, they do play a positive role. On top of all this is our connection with meat. Once again, globally, in particular Western countries, we consume a lot of meat, more than we probably should. But when you start to say that to people, hey, let's consider eating less meat, people feel really affronted because it's part of their culture, part of their identity. And I totally get that. Like, I completely understand. Imagine saying to an Italian person, oh, you can't eat pasta anymore. You know, like, people are going to feel that way. When you think of what is typically Australian food, like if you ask that question, what image comes to mind? It's meat on a barbecue. It's complex, is what I'm trying to say. Some countries have already introduced dietary guidelines around meat intake. Sweden, Germany, Qatar. They're saying, okay, within our country, these are what we recommend, the amounts of meat and fish and etc. that you consume, which are beneficial for the environment. We tried to do that in Australia a number of years ago with the release of the new dietary guidelines, and there was a lot of backlash around it, in particular from the food industry. Look, the other thing that you have to consider within this argument is that meat is a huge exporter. It's a big commodity. And so therefore, we don't really want to shift people's ideas around meat because
it's against the commercial interests.
Yeah, I would say that we need to consider doing things differently. So I certainly encourage people to eat meat, but let's just eat a little less and try and source it from farms that are producing it in a way. Yeah, on a smaller scale. The meat tax, if we get to the stage, like, that is an effective strategy at a population level. And I certainly haven't read enough about it to say, but I did mention to my students recently when I was teaching that may be necessary in order to shift food choices at a population level. So,
do you know of any countries who have implemented a meat tax?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I don't know either. Coming back to climate change and all these questions around what burgers should we consume? Should we consume burgers? What cars should we drive? Should we use plastic straws, etc.? These questions are important, but as Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat candidate at the US presidency, mentioned and pointed out, they are not striking at the heart of the problem. How can we influence corporations as well, in taking that aspect? Do you feel that as consumers we have power?
Unfortunately, in the current space, I would say no. We don't have a lot of power. When you look at the food system and the people that have the power, it is big business. It's really scary when you look at the percentage of companies that have control over, say, seeds or chemicals or grain trading. Like, 4 companies have control over 70% of one industry, 80%. And same goes for the food industry. So when it comes to food, big business have a lot of power. And as consumers, no. But there's ways in which we can shift that. I really love the model that they use in the US and Canada. It's called Food Policy Councils. So it's a coming together of key people from across the food system who identify what the community's needs are. So I'm talking a farmer representative, someone from health, someone from food justice, someone from food waste, someone from local government, someone from the retail sector, that the whole food system is represented, that they engage with the community about what they want, and then they put forward policy proposals or projects within their local area to push for change. And they have some really positive wins. That's what I talk about, food citizens. We need to believe that we have the power to create change. Food advocacy and coming together is one way in which we can do that.
You were mentioning a little bit the situation of women, but they are a big part of growing our food, 75% you were saying, but yet they are yet to experience equality in their access to land I just would like to touch on sexism. Have you experienced yourself sexism, and do you feel it's been a barrier to the promotion of your ideas?
I'm really lucky in that throughout my career, I've worked in a predominantly like a really heavily female-oriented profession. So I've been surrounded by inspiring and passionate and determined and amazing women who want to improve people's health, who want to do positive things for the environment. And I feel very grateful that I've been in an environment where I haven't had experienced a lot of sexism. Obviously, I'm a woman and that has come up in my life, but within food and nutrition in particular, we're really lucky. And the men that do work there are very inclusive. And then I see it also in the food movement. There's a lot of women that work in this space. I don't think it's had an influence on me personally.
I shared with you before this interview some articles, some hot news. And the first article was published by The Guardian earlier this week that said 250 million children worldwide forecast to be obese by 2030. And in this article, they draw a parallel between obesity and climate change management, saying that basically lots of politics showcase their goodwill to do something about it without ever really tackling the problem, not wanting to confront commercial interests and compromise them. Too often also obesity is described as an individual problem. How do you think we can reframe it and influence in another way the political speech around obesity?
This area is really complex. And this is my take on it. From a food systems perspective, we grow these large-scale monocultures, wheat, soya. I'm stepping back a bit here, but just to give you some background. Wheat, soy, corn. We grow these monocultures and then these ingredients are turned into these highly processed foods. Take soft drink, for example, but many others foods on our shelves. They're everywhere. These foods are abundant. They are heavily marketed to us. The markup on these foods within the supermarket are often a lot greater, like as in there's more profit to be made on these products. So obviously that's a good thing for the retailers. We live in this world where these are the environment in which we live. We also have a very few number of companies that control these food products. And then the food industry are really powerful lobbyists. So whenever governments put forward things that are going to have, not all the time, but a lot of the time, there's immediate backlash from food industry and there's significant pushback. It's really difficult to get things over the line because of how influential and how powerful they are. You put all this together and it's inevitable, as well as the decreasing physical activity levels, weight has increased because we're in a world where it's easy for us to consume like this and it's set up in a way that fosters this. The challenge is talked about as being an individual problem. And when you think about all of these things that I've just mentioned, like the individual trying to navigate their place in this, it's often referred to as an obesogenic environment, but it's more than that. Like it's power of the food industry, it's the marketing that takes place, it's the everything else that goes on. It is no wonder that rates of obesity are increasing. And what gets really difficult is that whenever policies are put forward, say around the sugar taxing, sugar sweetened beverages, there's this immediate feeling of a nanny state. No, we can't have that. When actually it's not an equal playing field. We do need at some stage governments to say, let's put the health of our people, our population ahead of profits of big business, because that's really all it is. And how we shift that, gosh, if I knew.
You would not be food advocate anymore.
I wouldn't, because I know so many incredible people pushing for this. It's always hit with a brick wall.
I often read that it's about freedom, those people blocking those laws saying, well, people are free. We need to maintain the freedom of people. But I was reading a book lately on climate change and what to do about it. And also he was talking about that, just mentioning freedom at all in all the conversations. And he was saying, well, when we developed a policy to actually restrain the speed on the roads so that you avoid killing people or not drinking, yes, it it is blocking some extent the freedom of people, but it's to protect people's lives, and nobody actually sees a problem with that. So why is it a problem to develop some laws, change behaviors in that field?
The big thing when it comes to food is the meaning that food has in our lives. We eat food for enjoyment, for pleasure, for taste. There's this personal attachment to it. That's, I think, the biggest shift that also needs to take place is what are our values around food and around the environment. There's been some really interesting stuff that's happened in the UK looking at food values and how we do help to shift things. And one thing that comes up is getting people to reconnect with the source of their food, reconnect with food, because we've lost that. We have totally lost the connection with food, with our farmers. So therefore, reconnecting again, you start to see it in a different light as just then something that you're choosing for its taste or for its cost or for its convenience. You make decisions based on more the universalism or something. So
reducing the distance between ourselves and the food and where it's produced.
It's very important.
Is there some advice that you have for listeners? Some key things that are fairly easy to implement and that you could recommend to our listeners if they want to shift their behaviors towards food?
My biggest thing is start small. Think about what you are interested in, what you connect with, and start with that. Like, don't feel like you can do everything, because this is really about a journey. Getting people to take one step and feel comfortable with where they are, and then take another step and then another. Things like eating seasonally. Do you even know what foods are in season? Because we walk into the supermarkets, everything is available at all times. So look for seasonal guides. There's a Sustainable Table is a website that has seasonal guides for Victoria. Eat Well Tasmania has seasonal guides for Tasmania, and then there's a seasonal food guide for Queensland, and I'm not sure about the other states. The other thing that I would really say, like, visit your local farmers markets, but not and try and seek out a farmer. See if you can distinguish between a farmer and a reseller and have a chat to them. For those that feel comfortable doing so, talk about what it's like for them. Like, really start to understand what it's like for a farmer, because for me personally, that's been the biggest shift in my behaviour, is getting to know farmers, understanding what it's like for them, recognising the enormous value they play in our food. Because without farmers, we have no food. And I certainly have no idea when it comes to food growing. So I am so very grateful that farmers are working long hours and really long hours to grow food for me and my family and for us all. The other thing that I would say is look on the Community Supported Agricultural Network Australia New Zealand website for local CSAs, which is Community Supported Agriculture. So that's where you sign up with direct with a farm for a season. Generally, you commit to buying a season of fruit and veggies, like a box, or a season of meat, like. It's a way that the farmer and the person, individual, I don't want to call you a consumer, but that eater, that we share the risk. Because farmers are probably one of the only professions where there are things outside of their control, completely outside of their control, that influence what they produce and their livelihood. And with the changing climate, it's going to have a significant impact on our farmers. If we are involved with supporting them directly, then that's really valuable. There's also multi-farmer CSAs in Melbourne. There's Ceres for those that live in Melbourne. I'm sure everyone knows Ceres. In Brisbane, there's Food Connect, and also spray-free pharmacy is another option. A local co-op might be something that you're interested in as well, like joining one or starting one, and I can provide some information in the show notes about that if people are interested.
Another article I shared with you was on the global criminalization of climate change activists that we observe at the moment. We've seen that Queensland was about to fast-track some laws to crack down on climate protesters. More recently, the City of London has banned entirely the protest of the movement Extinction Rebellion. In France as well, more recently, we've seen really the police being extremely violent with protesters. What do you think of radical movements such as Extinction Rebellion? They are claiming they are a non-violent movement, but yet face the actions of the government, which are extremely radical with them. So what are your thoughts about that?
I think for the most part, people involved with Extinction Rebellion are completely non-violent. Sure, they're using civil disobedience to get people's attention, but I think the media is probably highlighting those small, very small instances where violence has been involved, although I think one of the challenges here in Queensland is governments claiming that it's violent but not showing any evidence around that. I read an interesting thing about people, one particular woman, I think in her 50s, saying, we've done peaceful protests and we've done letters to the ministers and we've signed petitions and nothing's worked. We're getting louder and you need to start paying attention. And really that's what I see Extinction Rebellion is people going, come on, like what do we need to do? I feel that governments are just feeling threatened. There's very little action here in Australia around climate change. They're feeling threatened. And so when people feel threatened, they become defensive. And I think it's one way is to just shut people down. I read an interesting tweet from Michael Berkman. He's the Greens Minister for Maiwar. And he said, so I'm just repeating him verbatim, without peaceful, disruptive but non-violent protests, we wouldn't have votes for women and First Nations people, a woman's right to choose, the defeat of military conscription, the 8-hour working day and the 5-day working week. These were often illegal at the time. By bandying people together, governments often have no option but to change things. It's a big change. Like it's shifting things from this capitalist, profit-driven model to actually putting the environment, putting health, putting social justice things first and foremost. My thoughts are, because I certainly can become disillusioned, like other people, that let's not sit around and wait for governments to change. Let's act at the grassroots level. What can you do? Whether that's your individual choices, but also start meeting with your local member. Start talking with them. Tell them what you want. We need to be more vocal about what it is we want. They are meant to be representing us. Let's vote for the people that are going to put these issues front and centre.
When you see those governments who are not listening and really even worse, take violent actions against peaceful protests, I find it can be very, very depressing. How do you keep hope for the future?
I feel really fortunate in that I've always viewed the world through an optimistic lens. So, I guess I've always looked on the bright side. I've always looked for the good in things. I've always, for the most part, thought that the cup is half full and not half empty. So I feel very fortunate in that I come from a place with that perspective. The thing is that in my mind, there's no other choice. Yes, it can be totally overwhelming at times, and I've felt that many times in the work that I do. However, what I realise is that every little step we take moves us forward, and that's really important for people to recognise, is that you may feel that the little bit that you're doing is insignificant, but actually if we are really all heading in the same direction, like that's where the power lies.
Would you have a cultural recommendation for our listeners, a book? You've mentioned a few books already, but lately you're reading about this topic, but also about any topic, something that inspired you.
Recently, as I mentioned, I really enjoy connecting with farmers and learning about their lives and their joys and their struggles. And I read this fabulous book last year. It's called Letters to a Young Farmer, and it's an American book. It's fabulous. Like by the end of it, I was like, man, I'm going to become a farmer. But in Australia, we also do have a similar book, and it's called Farming Democracy, and that's available through the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, and that's been developed by the Australian Food Sovereignty. So that's another great book to read.
Oh, sounds good. Thank you so much, Kylie.
Thank you, Roxanne.
Thank you for listening. Visit our website gosimon.org to find out more about all the books and references mentioned in this episode. If you are based in Brisbane, Kylie has listed for you local food co-ops and 3 urban farms to check out. If you have enjoyed this episode, share it. The amazing women we interview deserve to be heard widely. See you in 2 weeks.